Hi, this is Angela Williams, and I want to tell you about my creative computing project. This is the final report. During my creative computing project, just a little description on it. My project is from my social studies unit on the American Revolutionary War. My final project was to have students to tell about two of the specific causes of the Revolutionary War, which one was the French and Indian War, the causes and effect that had on the American Revolutionary War, and the other one was what the American colonists would protest: no taxation without representation. These both directly led to the Revolutionary War, so I thought it was important to have my students do their scratch program on these two particular things that they learned. As I prepared for this, I have a mock scratch program, famous George Washington, which I showed my students and showed them how to work, and some of them took lots of examples during the program off of mine. Each group created their own scenes, and they had to have at least 3 scenes and at least 2 characters for each group. I gave them lots of examples of their particular causes and which ones that they needed to use. Now, during my lesson, I used lots of technology and student learning strategies to help teach this. So, as I began teaching my units with a small group of students. There were 2 different groups of those students. As my peers began to support and troubleshoot with each other, I was walking around from the group, addressing the ones who are having difficulty with some of the tasks of coding, of putting them in the right order and so forth. But then some groups were beginning to master those tasks as they went along. So each one was troubleshooting and supporting one another. Not only did they troubleshoot in groups, but they were troubleshooting independently from one another. One would reread when it was their turn over the commands and figure out what they needed to do. They would do this maybe while I was talking with their partner about something different with their characters. So lots of information, lots of time, and lots of hard work went into this, and they were all using their Chromebooks and using technology and continually working in this program and learning it. I managed the use of technology for these students by using the Chromebooks, of course, like I said, for most of the time. But at the beginning of the lesson, we did graphic organizers, and those plus the directions, for Scratch were all put into their Google Classroom. So they were able to complete those graphic organizers, and then they stayed in their Chromebooks for the completion of the story. And now, as we were working on the lesson, and I intended it, this is the way I set up the design process. I wanted students to imagine what they would be like, what the characters would be like in their story, and determine how those characters would talk about the information, the story that they were trying to tell. So they began by logging in, and we went through those directions, and then they chose their sprites. The sprites had different categories like animals, peoples, fantasy, dance, and music that they could choose from. Again, they had to choose at least 2 sprites. As also, when they were imagining what their background would look like, they went to their backdrops, and they were able to choose from different topics like fantasy, music, sports, outdoors, indoors, and space. So again, they had to choose at least 2 or more scenes to be able to tell this story and how that would work. As they continued on with the program, I wanted them to create their scratch story, and I knew it was going to be by trial and error. And so they were able to go to the costume bar located near the coding information, and they were able to design their sprites and make their sprites like they wanted to look. And they had a real good time with this. They can make their sprites bigger or smaller, as I did. You see I did in mine. Their sprites, of course, they still the focus they had to stay on as they were creating them, that they had to have this conversation and what they were going to look like and what they were going to say. Now, when they actually started coding or playing with the story, this is where they took their mock conversation and began to plug it into these blocks. So students began to code the story. They used the blocks that they had a choice of. For our main particular ones for this particular assignment were the motion, the looks, the sound, the events, and the control. So they had to have a control button to control when each sprite would talk. So this button they had when the green flag was clicked for each sprite, they knew it was that sprite's turn to talk, and that began the conversation between these two sprites. Also, they would use things like when they had different characters and they wanted them in a different scene. So they were able to invent their characters again and use the hide block so that those characters wouldn't be seen maybe in the first couple of scenes. Now, as they progressed through this, they did really good, and of course lots of trial and error, lots of time spent here, but they began to share their ideas for the story on the content that they had developed. And so each group read it several times. They kept checking it. They would save them, of course, to remember to save their ideas, and things would not get deleted. At the end of the process, my goal was for them to reflect on how well their story was written and how they liked the graphics, of course, and we kind of did that in the beginning. And then they were able to tell each other and give each other feedback. So all that was a very, very important process. In my report, I gave a description and a picture of one I thought of most of the computational artifacts, and this was one on decomposition. This particular student was trying to decompose his script blocks, and he had kind of gotten them in the wrong order, sometimes too many wait times or in the wrong place, and so he was trying to adjust those. And he was entering the conversations, and sometimes he would not let the sprite have enough time to be able to say it before the next character would talk. So all of that again was trial and error. So when we were doing that, again, we were focusing on the process of this, of getting the characters to talk, to speak, and for this program to make sense. So I think that it went really well. They liked designing their characters. They were real good at that. They excelled at that. They even invented new characters like Samuel Adams. They took an old sprite and kind of reinvented him or reimagined him and came into being. Something that I would improve would be maybe teaching more of the descriptions, examples of the main kinds of blocks, maybe going into greater detail as I'm learning more about the Scratch program. I went over some of the categories, but I think more of the different blocks that they could see, that they could have more options during coding. I think that would be something that would improve this design process. During the course of the lesson, there was, some failures because the students had difficulty hiding, showing their characters within the different scenes. Again, I would teach this beforehand in greater detail in the guided practice section of my lesson. And when they have trouble getting their character to speak, the wait time, kind of counting the seconds and letting everything work out as it should, again, taking longer and really putting emphasis on that. I think that would be important. Another very important component, like I was referring to earlier, the decomposition in my artifact was computational thinking. And so computational thinking was important to me because the decomposing, the breaking down into steps, just as you saw in the picture of my report. These basic commands, of course, allowed, it was everything that the students would use to make these characters work. So decomposition, that takes those complex parts like he was working on and that turns them into something manageable and something that he could use. So this led to different coding patterns. Sometimes that meant repeating cycles, designing, analyzing and testing those. And then the decomposition, even along with the abstraction, when students were using more than one sprite. So they had to be able to break it down and see things that would come to pass, maybe that wasn't just there in the blocks, and they would have to kind of figure it out and break those into more manageable parts. So that was very important, and the coding as well too. I was able to nurture their creativity, of course, again, like we said, over the sprites. Again, they had a lot of a good time with that. I showed them creativity, of course, with mine, and they got ideas, and they were able to feed off that. They talked through some of the issues and problems as we were going through it, and I talked through mine as I did it. When I was moving around to the group, I would give them feedback and try to ask them questions that were thought-provoking and maybe encourage their creativity. I did give them opportunities because they were able to develop their own character, so that was the main fact for creativity. Those opportunities were really great because the creativity, they would really brainstorm and bounce ideas off one another. They were able to share their work by playing it for the other groups and showing the other groups, and again, they would bounce ideas off of them, and they did come up with meaningful and fun stories. Again, I gave them opportunities for peer feedback. When they were presenting the stories, they could just give each other just things that they thought they did well, and maybe things they could work on next time. And so that was very important for us. Also, I really enjoyed creativity because we use the technology through our resources, through our Chromebooks, and we're able to develop this, and my kids had a real good time with that. So the process of all of this coming together, I see them learning and developing and being creative and using technology to do that and bouncing ideas off of one another. I thought that was very important, and I enjoyed this lesson very, very much.